So this is my technical breakdown of my inventory tool. I'm going to follow this in a very similar structure to my tutorial video, but instead of telling you, I'm going to tell you what's happening in the background. I've already done quite a lot of setup, so some items already exist, so I can use the inventory. I don't have to follow along and do all the setup again. So the first item of my tool is this item creator, and it's done through an editor utility. The important things I want to point out with it are these. These are details views, and basically what you can do is you can set a category over here. When you set your categories of your variables, you can set ones like set categories to show, and it will populate it as you wish. This is so I can run my editor utility and set these variables as I normally would in an editor, and it will automatically save across. Another aspect I want to talk about with this inventory is the creation of the blueprint. I did attempt to do this editor utility within C++. However, that threw some errors as getAssetTools and createAsset are blueprint specific functions. You can do them in C++, however, they do not function the same and it does not like working with them. It likes to be a blueprint function. So unfortunately, when it creates a blueprint, it has to create a parent class of just blueprint. This means that I have to reparent it within code, meaning I can't get a reference to the item. So for example, if I create a new item, it will create both a blueprint and a data asset for it. However, the user does have to go into the blueprint and find the data asset and set it themselves. Another feature I want to point out with this editor utility is the spawning of a notification widget. This took some time to perfect, as I did try to do it in a plugin way, as we were told in the tutorial. However, adding a plugin to a pre-existing project broke the entire project and made it unusable. Instead, I was able to take the code of the spawning of the widget exactly and create a blueprint library out of it. This means that now when I say create a colour scheme, a notification widget is appearing down there telling me it was successful. And for example, if I don't have an item within my item, if I create an item, it will tell me it's failed. This is just so I can have a little bit more user feedback, because otherwise I was clicking the button and I had no idea if it was being created or not. I had to go and check myself. So with the inventory itself, some features I do like is that everything on the back line is in C++. This is because I wanted to challenge myself, and I knew I could create it in Blueprint, and I did create the prototype quite quickly, so I tried to refactor as much as possible into C++. And I was able to get it mainly done, with a few exceptions, with functions that preferred to be in Blueprints and worked better. For example, all of this is being set in C++. All the set item, set array elm, that is all in C++. Because in Blueprint, there is this function called set array elm, which can be used and passed through with wildcards. However, that does not exist in C++ because C++ likes you to tell it explicitly. So I had to create my own one, which became quite difficult as I then realised I had to create a struct item as long with it. So all of these data, like inventory datas, they include the item itself and the quantity of it. So every time I had to set item at index, which is the function that's called when you spawn an item in, you then have to use the function that creates the inventory contents, which broke about 50 times. I have spoken about the functionalities of this inventory in my tutorial. It's mainly just checks against each other to see if they are the same or not. So I don't feel like that functionality is worth going over, as you can just watch the tutorial video. The bit I do want to mention is the back end of it, of something called tuple. Basically, something I had to do is, when I am checking against the item, for example, if I want to drop this onto this, I'm checking to see if it is the same item. And for that I need to do getItemInfo@index. and that needed to return the item itself and the quantity of it. However, you can't just write bool and int in instead of void for it to return two items. You have to use tuples. The problem with tuples is you can't use them in tandem with ufunctions. So I cannot create any tuples that are blueprint callable. So instead you have to create sub ones which return just one item of the tuple, which is quite irrelevant and feels a bit long-handed, so I wish they would make tuple a ufunction. Tuples are quite challenging because they are array types, which basically means you have to create it like you would create an array, and then every time you want to get an aspect of that item, you have to do .get, and then in brackets what you want of that item, which also took a long time to learn as I was not doing it correctly for a long time. Additionally, when you return, you have to return make tuple, which is a function of the tuple time, and then you'd put in your inputs exactly the same as you would when you're calling a regular function. With that in all play, I can use that in tandem with the shifting across, so if I press shift and click, it will find a stackable slot and then an empty slot. So as you can see, it's stacked automatically, but as there's not enough space, it's just finding the next empty slot. And if there is no space, it won't do anything at all. The searching part was the first time I had ever attempted to do something like that. As you can see, say I've got the same icon and I can't tell what type it is. You can easily search, so type 1, we don't have anything, but if we have category 2, these are of type category 2, and they are shown at the top with empty slots all around them. So I want to see number 3, that's type 3, and there's nothing in type 4. The same happens if you search. This is done on when the text changes, so you don't have to completely type out what you're typing. So I know something's called apple. If I type A, it's currently including all of the items because they all include the letter A, but if I continue, it will only give me apple. But if I type orange, immediately orange has come up because it's the only one that's got the letter O. An aspect I am proud of this is that it is all separated as much as it possibly could be. So all these slots are the same class, they're just duplicated across. So they all have the exact same functionalities, and the slots themselves do not care what the inventory is doing. The inventory may care about the slots because the slots are a child of them. They are contained within the inventory. The slots themselves have no care about it. When we're dropping on the Dropbox, neither the inventory or the HUD care. It is only communication between the slot itself, the Dropbox, and the player that the item is spawning from. So as you can see, when I drop it, an item spawns. That pop-up widget is only when it's within range, but it does tell you what item it is. There is impulse added as well, so if you do make it a circle, it will roll, but if it's not, it will just spawn away from you, which can be quite fun. So there is functionality added for later use. For example, as you saw when I was creating the items, there is this item usable function. So I've made this as usable for the future as I could. So for example, there is this item usable here, which has no current usage in the game. However, there are blueprint functions for me to get this item here. So for example, if we go into the player character and we use the key. So in here, if we wanted to debug out and I wanted to get item at selected slot, that is a function that's included. So the selected slot is the one that's got the coloured border around it. And then I can debug out this log of what item it is. As it's a PDA item, I can get the item name itself, and I can debug that log out instead. So now when I compile and I play, if I add my items back in and I put this in my selected slot, and I press OK, the item name will appear. If it's this one, it'll be orange. This is so the user could eventually expand on it and use the items how they wish. So I didn't want to put any implementation for them, as I felt that would be something they'd want to do themselves. Overall, I'm quite happy with the complexity of this project, as there are over 20 different classes within C++. I've tried to transfer as much as I can over, and it has worked in my favour, as I was able to learn quite a lot of C++ whilst doing it. For example, some elements just not being included in C++, like set array. Additionally, C++ doesn't have stuff like format text that work the same, so I had to construct my own way to do it with using append on the end. The colour scheme itself I'm quite happy with, because it tied it together to make it more readable, because when it was just a grey box it looked a bit naff. That's why I've given them some default ones that they can select from, so they can create their own one if they want to, but they don't have to. They can use one that was created by me.